Right now, in the world's harshest ocean environments, a demolition operation unlike anything else on Earth is taking place. 12,000 floating cities of steel are reaching the end of their lives. Over the next 2 decades, more than 2,600 must be dismantled, an undertaking that will cost $210 billion. But there's a problem. There are more platforms that need to be surgically dismembered than there are vessels on the planet capable of lifting them. And some of these structures have become accidental Noah's Arks, home to fragile ecosystems that will die the moment the steel is cut away. Every one of these platforms was built to withstand hurricane-force waves and decades of saltwater corrosion. Now the bill is coming due. The companies that profited from them are legally obligated to return the ocean floor to its original state, but nature has rewritten the contract. What was supposed to be a simple industrial demolition has become the most complex environmental puzzle of the century, one that no government has yet solved. They were never designed to come down. A single jacket structure weighs as much as the Eiffel Tower. The top sides rise 20 stories above the waterline, crammed with 30,000 tons of processing equipment, helipads and crew quarters, and they're fixed to the seabed with piles, driven 300 feet into the crust, built to survive 100-foot rogue waves. Taking one apart piece by piece at sea is like performing open-heart surgery in the middle of a hurricane. But the clock is now running on over half the world's offshore platforms, and the legal hammer is about to fall. In the Gulf of Mexico alone, more than 3,800 structures are waiting. Under American law, operators are required to remove everything, plug every well, sever every casing 15 feet below the mudline, and return the seafloor to its original state. The problem is that state no longer exists. Over decades, these steel skeletons have been colonized by cold water corals, sponges, and fish populations that didn't live there before. On 13 of 14 platforms examined by marine biologists, Lophelia pertusa reefs, some of the slowest growing and most vulnerable deep-sea corals on Earth, had established thriving cities. Meanwhile, governments are staring at a financial landmine. The United Kingdom expects decommissioning in its North Sea sector to cost £51 billion. But many of the smaller companies that acquired these aging assets have balance sheets that can't survive a single removal. In the Gulf of Mexico, the federal government holds only $3.5 billion in bonds against a projected cleanup cost of up to $70 billion. If a company goes bankrupt, the taxpayer gets the entire toxic liability. And then there is the hardware problem. To lift a topside weighing 30,000 tons away from its jacket, you need a vessel with twin catamaran hulls, dynamic positioning, and a lifting capacity that didn't exist until 2016. The Pioneering Spirit, built by Allseas, is the only ship on the planet capable of this operation. It's 382 meters long. It can remove an entire platform deck in a single motion. But there is only one, and it's booked for years. Every day, a platform sits idle. Its owners bleed millions, and its underwater ecosystem grows more entrenched. This collision of money, law, and biology has now converged on a single site, an industrial yard on the River Tees in northeast England. There, the first true dismantling of a North Sea giant was attempted. What the engineers found inside that structure when they cut it open forced them to stop every machine and rewrite the entire plan. The solution they devised would prove more audacious than the original construction itself, and it would ignite a global war over whether these behemoths should be removed at all. The war started on a single day in April 2017, when the largest object ever moved by human beings arrived at a dock nobody believed could hold it. The Brent Delta topside, all 24,000 tons of it, had been lifted off its legs in the middle of the North Sea by the Pioneering Spirit and transported 300 miles to the Able Yard at Teesside. Watching it inch through the estuary, engineers held their breath. No one had ever attempted to dismantle a structure this size on land before. The plan was surgical. Cut it into manageable sections, salvage 97% of the steel, and prove that full decommissioning was technically possible. But the moment the first acetylene torches touched the steel, the entire operation stopped. Inside the pipework, encrusting every surface not visible from the outside, were thick deposits of gray-black sludge. The team had expected some grime. What they found was a toxic cocktail of mercury, naturally occurring radioactive material known as norm, and heavy metals that had precipitated out of 40 years of production. The pipes themselves were lined with asbestos. And there was something else. As they cut into the support legs, seawater drained from the internal columns, and with it came a slurry of pulverized marine life, the crushed remains of the cold water coral colonies that had wrapped themselves around every submerged inch. The crew realized they weren't just demolishing a factory. They were gutting an accidental reef, and doing it inside sight of a protected coastline. Able UK had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. They had constructed what amounted to a sealed industrial sarcophagus, a containment platform with a drainage system that captured every drop of runoff, filtration beds to strip out hydrocarbons, and shielded cutting bays to protect workers from radiation. 99% of the platform would ultimately be recycled, a figure that still stands as one of the most efficient industrial recovery operations in history. But that achievement came with a price tag no smaller company could dream of paying, and a revelation that made the entire principle of full removal suddenly look dangerously obsolete. Marine ecologists who had been monitoring the Brent field for years published their findings within months. The platforms weren't barren metal hulks. They were the most productive marine habitats in the North Sea. The Lophelia pertusa coral that had colonized the structures had grown into dense thickets sheltering millions of fish, from commercially valuable cod to critically endangered wolfish. On 14 platforms surveyed, 13 hosted thriving coral populations. Some colonies measured 12 feet across and had been growing since Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Drilling muds and produced water had actually created a chemical gradient that stimulated biodiversity, not suppressed it. As one scientist put it, pulling the rigs was like demolishing the Amazon to replant grass and calling that restoration. The backlash was immediate. Shell, the operator, had fulfilled its legal duty. The Brent Delta removal was celebrated as a masterclass in environmental responsibility. But environmental groups that had spent decades campaigning against oil now found themselves in an impossible position. Argue for total removal, and you kill the corals you swore to protect. Argue to leave them in place, and you let oil companies walk away from their mess. The Norwegians, the Dutch, the Australians, the American Gulf states, everyone was watching Teesside. If full removal was the standard, the global price tag would bankrupt entire nations. If it wasn't, then who drew the line and where? The front line of this war runs through a single clause in international maritime law: the obligation to return the seabed to its original condition. Original condition, however, does not exist when the very substrate of life has been replaced by 40 years of undisturbed ecosystem growth. And as governments stalled, the platforms kept aging. Corrosion rates in the splash zone accelerate after 30 years. A single structural failure on an abandoned wellhead could dump tens of thousands of barrels into the sea before anyone arrived. The clock is now ticking on something far more fragile than steel, because in a few months, a single court ruling on the other side of the world will force every nation to choose, and that choice will decide whether we rip these reefs out or leave the world's most dangerous experiment in accidental conservation to run its course. That court ruling hit in March of 2023. A federal judge in Louisiana, weighing a case brought by environmental groups against the Department of the Interior, ordered the government to enforce decommissioning timelines that had been ignored for decades. The numbers were staggering. More than 2,700 wells and 500 platforms in the Gulf of Mexico alone were now officially overdue, some by more than a decade. The ruling didn't just demand action. It exposed a financial time bomb that no one in Washington wanted to acknowledge. Here is the math that terrified every regulator in the room. The entire federal bonding pool for offshore decommissioning in American waters sits at $3.5 billion. But the total cost of removing those 500 platforms and plugging those 2,700 wells is conservatively estimated at $40 to $70 billion. That means for every dollar set aside, there could be $20 of liability. And the companies holding those aging assets are not all Shell and Exxon. Many are small operators who bought geriatric platforms in the 2000s, when oil prices were high and the end game seemed distant. Those companies have since watched production decline, margins collapse, and bankruptcy become a boardroom conversation. If they fold, the entire cleanup falls on American taxpayers, who have no idea this liability even exists. But the financial nightmare is only half of what the Louisiana rulings set in motion. Because to comply with the law overnight, you would need an armada of heavy-lift vessels that does not exist. There is only one pioneering spirit. There are perhaps a dozen other vessels capable of removing smaller jackets in shallow water. At current capacity, the Gulf of Mexico could remove maybe 35 platforms per year. To clear the backlog of overdue structures would take 15 years of uninterrupted work. And every day, the other platforms keep aging. Corrosion in the splash zone, the region battered by waves and oxygen, accelerates exponentially after year 30. A single structural collapse could rupture a wellhead and dump 40,000 barrels of crude into the Gulf before any response vessel reaches the site. This is not hypothetical. After Hurricane Ivan in 2004, one damaged platform off Louisiana leaked for 6 years, undetected, becoming one of the worst marine spills in American history without anyone even knowing it was happening. And now, into this impossible equation came the ecological evidence that no politician wanted to hear. The Rigs to Reefs program, which allows operators to leave portions of platforms in place as artificial reefs, had been running in the Gulf since the 1980s. Over 500 platforms had already been converted. Scientists found that these submerged structures had become indispensable. A single 8-leg jacket in 90 feet of water hosts more fish biomass per square meter than any natural reef in the region. Snapper, grouper, amberjack, the foundation species of Gulf fisheries, spawn in the shadow of these legs. Removing the platforms would collapse those fish stocks, devastating a billion-dollar commercial and recreational industry. Researchers at the University of St. Andrews put it bluntly: when you take them out, you are not returning the water to some wonderful ecological condition. You are actually leaving it worse because you are taking out one of the only biodiversity hotspots around. The Louisiana judge, faced with this evidence, did something that sent tremors across every ocean on Earth. He carved out an exception. The government could approve partial removals, leaving lower jacket sections in place, but only if operators could prove that removal would cause greater environmental harm than leaving them. In other words, the law now required a weighing of two contradictory duties: protect the seabed or protect what grew on top of it. The burden of proof was on the oil companies. The very companies that had fought every environmental regulation now had to hire marine biologists to argue that their abandoned trash was actually a national treasure. And the irony was, they were right. This ruling has now opened a door no one can close. Norway, facing the decommissioning of 400 North Sea platforms, is watching. Australia, with its remote offshore fields in cyclone-prone waters, is watching. The Asia-Pacific region, with more than 2,500 platforms needing removal in the next decade, is watching. Every nation must now decide: tear it all down, bankrupt the industry, and kill the reefs in the name of purity, or endorse a compromise that legalizes an oil company graveyard as a permanent feature of the ocean. And while the diplomats argue, one engineering team in the Shetland Islands has already found a third path, something so audacious it had never been attempted. They are not just cutting the steel away. They are building something entirely new from the bones of these monsters. The Greenhead Yard in Shetland is the sharp end of the third path. Here, the steel that once held back the North Sea is not being buried or memorialized. It is being reborn. Every beam pulled from a dismantled topside is shot blasted, ultrasonically tested, and recertified to the same grade as new structural steel. The difference is that producing a ton of virgin steel emits nearly 2 tons of carbon dioxide. Reusing this steel emits almost nothing. And the sheer volume now arriving at British yards changes the economics of decommissioning entirely. A single large jacket contains enough high-grade steel to build 3 wind turbine monopiles. The operators who once saw removal only as a cost now have a salvage value that can cover a fifth of the project, sometimes more. The taxpayer abyss. That $40 to $70 billion Gulf liability shrinks every time a buyer emerges. But the steel is only half the pivot. Because the very crisis that stopped the cutting at Teesside has forced a different question. What if we stopped trying to pretend the oil era never happened, and instead built the clean era directly onto its foundations? In the northern North Sea, engineers are now converting a retired platform topside into a green hydrogen production unit, powered by offshore wind. It will split seawater into hydrogen with zero carbon emissions, and the existing pipeline network, designed to carry gas, will transport that hydrogen to shore. The skeleton stays. The function flips. The rig that once sucked carbon into the atmosphere will now be part of a system that replaces it. This is not a niche experiment. The International Energy Agency estimates that up to 40% of the world's offshore wind potential lies in waters deeper than current fixed foundation technology can economically reach. But decommissioned jackets, already proven in those exact depths, can be repurposed as substructures for floating turbines, battery storage hubs, and carbon storage injection points. A platform that once held a drilling derrick can now anchor a 60-megawatt turbine. The Norwegian continental shelf, with its 400 platforms, is being mapped for exactly this conversion. The oil companies required to clean up are discovering that their most valuable asset is not the remaining fuel, but the metal and the mooring points. They are, quite literally, selling the bones of the old monster to build the body of the new one. And back in the Gulf of Mexico, where the court's exception for partial removal now holds, the compromise has taken an unexpected form. Operators are cutting topsides above the waterline, removing the hazardous infrastructure, while leaving the lower jackets in place as designated artificial reefs. But those reefs are now being surrounded by offshore aquaculture pens, where the thriving fish populations can support commercial harvest without wild stock depletion. A platform that was once a contamination risk is now the anchor of a local food economy. The Rigs to Reefs program has mutated into Rigs to Ecosystems, a living rebuttal to the idea that the only good ocean is an empty one. The monstrous irony is now complete. The 12,000 steel islands that were the visible machines of fossil fuel extraction are becoming the invisible skeleton of our attempt to undo the damage. The steel graveyard is not a burial ground. It is a salvage depot for the largest material inheritance humanity has ever dismantled. The only question that remains is whether we can repurpose steel quickly enough to outrun the corrosion and the mounting debt. And in one final twist, the giant that started it all has an answer no one expected. The pioneering spirit, the vessel that lifted Brent Delta, was originally designed with an even bolder purpose. Its architects had already mapped a future where the ship would not just dismantle oil rigs, but install offshore wind substations using the same lift technology on the same waters. The single heaviest lift record in history was, it turns out, a dress rehearsal for the next energy infrastructure. That is the real story of the great offshore graveyard. We are not watching an industry tidy up its past. We are witnessing the collision of two worlds, where the carbon era hands over its skeleton to the clean era, and neither side entirely trusts the handshake. The platforms that rise from these waters in 2050 may look eerily like the ghosts of the ones being cut apart today. Repurposed to produce hydrogen or anchor turbines, their steel carrying the memory of old oil and the code of new electrons. The graveyard is not an ending. It is the world's largest material bank, a submerged inventory of proven engineering now being rewritten into a different kind of future. Whether that rewriting succeeds depends on law, money, and a question no generation has had to answer before. How much of the old world is worth saving to build the next? Thanks for watching. Subscribe and join us as we keep tracing the stories buried inside the biggest industrial transitions on the planet.